Okay, so now I'm just going to make a couple of terrains with all of the different options and all of our different inputs and outputs and functions that we have available to create some different types of terrains. And we're also going to be using a couple of different image maps to control a lot of these different settings. And all of the image maps I am using are included in the content folder for the tutorial. And we're going to start out by clicking on altitude and adding a fractal. And I'm also going to need to adjust the size of the function editor so that we can view all of our bottom options that we have, because the overall size that we have adjusted will increase with a lot of the different options and make it a little bit larger, especially when we're switching to the 3 noise fractal, which will end up extending it even further. But we can see our current terrain. We have basically our default values all set for our wavelength and origin. But let's go ahead and adjust these ourselves so we have something a little more unique and completely custom. Go into our origin, change all those values to 0. And I'm going to set our wavelength to 0.2 on all of our axes. And actually on our Y, I'm going to set that to 0.277. And that's just going to stretch it out a little bit further. I'm also going to zoom out our scale, so we're at 0.5 and we can see a little bit more of our terrain. We can also see that 7.7 I added to the y-axis is really stretching us out a lot more with our overall terrain. And I'm going to go up to our connection between our position and our fractal, and I'm going to add a math node. And of course the last math node that we used is not compatible with this link, so we're going to click into a blank area, add our math node. We want to change this to vector operations, and we're going to change this to offset. And I'm going to delete our connection for our position and just connect our offset. Now there's a couple of options I didn't cover before, and basically what we have available for our math node once we are connecting these two. If we take a look and open up our math node, you can see we have the ability to use multiply, and under conversions we can use RGB to vector and RGB to HLS. And under vector operations, which we can also see a second panel over here, which is going to include all of our vector operations since that's currently selected, we have rotation and twist, projection, matrix transformation, composer 3, normalize, and vector product. If we switch to rotation and twist, we can click edit. This gives us the ability to rotate around our entire node and to also twist it on specific axes, and we can get some really neat looks that way. We can go to projection, which gives us the ability to change our mapping modes, and because of that we get some neat looking terrains. Of course, with the cylindrical mode right now, we're getting this little point in the center, and you might need to blend that with another surface in order for it to turn out correctly. We could also change that to spherical, and we're going to notice the same sort of effect. We have our matrix transformations, and this allows us to do a little bit of extra editing on the position of our material. If you take a look, we have X set at 1 on line 1, line 2, Y is set at 1, line 3, Z is set at 1, and the rest are all zeros. But what we can do is modify these lines and adjust certain numbers, and we can end up with some really neat transformations in order to adjust both the position and certain origin points of our overall material. And we can see all of those showing up. Our next is Composer 3, which technically is not compatible with this because we cannot connect our position. And then we have our Normalize, which brings us back to the ability to reconnect our material. But we can see this one really doesn't create the kind of effect we want either. And then our last is Vector Product. And that's pretty much going to wipe out our scene right now. But we do have a connector that we can adjust to compatible nodes. And since that is a red line, we want to make sure we're using red line compatible nodes. So I'm going to delete that. And we're going to change our vector product back to offset. Let's just make some modifications to our fractal. One thing I want to do is extract our origin and connect that to a turbulence node. And that way we can add some extra detail. We want to make sure that we're using the advanced turbulence so that we can define that a little bit better. Although we can still use View 4 style turbulence, which does give us some extra options. We can still use our noise. Combination mode we can change, but we don't have the ability to view those vortices, and it can give a different type of an appearance. So it really depends on what it is that you want. Advanced turbulence I prefer because it really does give you the best look. We can see that showing up with just our Perlin noise gradient right now. We can change this to something else. We could do cracks. And we really don't see too much of an effect with our cracks on. We do crystals. And we can see those showing up, and we have those nice little bits of area. I'm going to change this to Voronoi. Make that a little bit bigger. We can also edit this. I can make this smooth rounded and change this to second to third neighbor. And now we see a lot more distortion in our overall material. We could do the second closest neighbor. And we still have a bit more distortion than our original, but that might be a little bit too much. So I'm going to change that back to closest neighbor. We're going to stick with smooth rounded. I'm going to click OK. And one thing I want to do is adjust our wavelength. I'm going to change our wavelength to 3 on all of our axes. And we'll see a much larger distortion and a lot more detail that's easily defined and easier to see, rather than lots of small details where we really don't see that overall effect on the terrain. I'm going to adjust our X this time and make our X set at 4. So we're going to be stretching a little bit more opposite than we were with the main fractal, where we have it stretching more on the Y, but this way we create some more turbulence in the opposite direction to create a much more varied effect and a little bit better of a look. We could also adjust our roughness, make that down really smooth. Just going to overall smooth out our terrain, but still give us that turbulence that we want without adding any extra detail. I'm just going to crank that back up a little. We can also adjust the repeat amount. And set to 5 looks a little bit better. I'm going to connect our advanced turbulence to our offset. But one thing I want to do is actually connect it directly to the offset of our parameter, so we can either extract that, or we could connect that directly to our advanced turbulence. And now we can see that showing up. A little bit of a different effect, and then we can adjust and connect our turbulence to our position. And we can take a look. And we don't see as much of those blending as we had before. So I am going to disconnect that and reconnect that back directly to the offset. And now we can see a lot more of that variation without losing any of the detail that we have created by that nice little bit of turbulence. And now I want to just set up a combiner. So we're going to select our link between altitude and simple fractal, add our combiner. We're going to stick with the blender. We can also see we've lightened up our area. I'm going to go back up to our graph options and make sure show all previews and graph is on. And then we can minimize the advanced turbulence and the offset, and also pull down our top nodes, our input nodes. Select our blender. And now I want to start working on our other material. So actually with our blender selected, so I'm just going to go ahead and select that link and delete that so we can start working on the next function, the next node. So I'm going to add in simple fractal. And we're going to connect our altitude so that we can actually take a look at it. And I'm just going to go in here, select Voronoi. We can see that under our wavelength, we still have our options set for our previous fractal that we created. But what I'm actually going to be doing this time is connecting our wavelength to the other turbulence that we had. And now we can take a look and see the terrain we've created, which is really interesting looking. Move that up. And that's basically all I want to do with that one. So we can disconnect and add our blender to it, connect our altitude to our blender, and let that process. And since we're just using a constant number for our ratio, we have an even distribution between the two materials. So what I want to do now is actually control this ratio with an image map. So I'm just going to click to get our red box, and I'm going to add a texture map node. Make sure we set this to projected texture map. We also have the ability to use animation maps for this, which means we can create an animated surface if we have an image sequence. So we could create some very interesting looking animated terrains and actually animate our ratio if we have an animated texture map. But I'm just going to stick with projected texture map right now. We're going to click on our little arrow to open up our chooser. And now these are all the gradients that I've created and that are included with the tutorial in the content folder. So we can use any one of these to control that overall value just because we have white and black. And that's going to be our major control. So let's just select number 6 right now and click OK. Right now it's refreshing, although it's really not connected. It's going to look exactly the same. But one thing I want to note is that whenever you're loading in any sort of image map into the function editor, it's always a good idea to set up a new collection within that chooser before you go ahead and load anything in. If we go back into our load, and we can see that this collection's already been added just because I've dragged the folder into the bitmap folder for where view stores all of our information. If I was to go ahead and just load in under Browse File and select specific images, the function editor has a habit of crashing when you do that. So it's a good idea to load everything in first into view, and then you don't have to worry about that happening. So what we can do is just connect our ratio to our projected texture map. I'm going to select our connector on the left, and we want to make sure we select our grayscale output. And now we can see that calculating. And because of the advanced turbulence that I have connected to the wavelength of our secondary fractal, it can take a long time for this to process. And that's just something to keep in mind when you are connecting turbulence to your wavelength. So now we can see this image showing up. And now because this is not a seamless texture and not a seamless image, we are seeing the edges of our image map. And that is also because we're viewing our scale at half. So instead of just seeing one box, where we would normally just see one image, we are seeing 4 of them. Because we're seeing a lot more information. At 0.5, we are doubling the size. So therefore, we see 4 of our image maps. There's a couple of ways we can fix this if we're not working with seamless. If we note with our projected texture map selected, under our tiling mode, we have tiling mode X and tiling mode Y. Currently right now it's set to repeat, so what it's actually doing is just repeating and copying it over, but because of that, our seams don't match up. We could change that to mirror on both of them, and that will correct that. And we'll just let that process. And I can see we really don't see those seams anymore. Although in some cases we do have some higher points and some higher areas showing up. So if you really are going to be working with image maps, that's definitely one thing to keep in mind. You might want to have everything worked out and seamless if you're going to be doubling it. In this case we're not going to be, so I'm going to change our scale to 2 on the X and the Y. And what that will do is stretch it out to fit on our current view that we can see, because we still have our scale set to 0.5. So in the actual texture and the actual function, if it was set to 1, we wouldn't see that, but right now we do. So we take a look, and we can see our origin is a little bit off, so we might need to adjust that origin to get it to fit correctly. But you can see we can easily control that overall ratio with an image map. Let's go ahead and try out another one. This one is going to be seamless, number 4, where we just have a diamond shape. So let's take a look at that. And it's also processing a little bit faster than our other one. But now we can see our overall material being reflected in there. I'm also going to adjust our scale back down to 1. And we also have this set right now to automatic mapping mode. If you wanted to, you could set that to flat vertical, which will give you a definite good representation. You could just change that right now. And basically, the automatic in this case is going to be flat vertical, so we're not really going to notice a change. But we can see that blending by using the image map between our different surfaces, because we have this image map showing up in each of the 4 sections. And another thing we can do is actually manipulate our image maps with the Turbulence node the same way we've manipulated our other options. And we can do that by using the origin. So I'm going to extract our origin parameter. And now we have this constant node, but I'm going to disconnect from there and just connect to the Turbulence node we already have. And now we can see our image is being altered and distorted. And if we also take a look at the output observer and actually see the effects of that, we can see a nice bit of twisting within our image and what's being calculated. But because this is taking so long to process, I'm just going to get rid of that constant node that we have in there, and I'm going to replace this texture map node with the fractal node. And what we also have is the remainder of our previous node, where we have our wavelength connected directly to that turbulence. I want to remove that because I do not want those connected. So now we can see our fractal showing up, separating our two surfaces. And it's still taking a little bit longer to process, but faster than it was before. So now we can see a nice even blend between our two different surfaces. We've got a really neat looking effect. And if I wanted to, I could filter these selections. So if I wanted to change what we're using for our overall fractal to separate these images and alter that a little, I can click on our link, just going to add a filter in there, and then we could either use a manual filter or we can select one of the options available within our filters. So let's just take a look. We can select a sine wave, and now we can see a lot more of a change between each of our different surfaces that we're cutting in half. But also by doing so, we're taking a little bit longer to process our terrain. And typically, the longer it takes to process this terrain, the longer it's usually going to take to render, depending. It really does depend on a lot of the different rendering settings you have, and sometimes it can be quicker, and sometimes it can take just a little bit longer. But we can see that filter showing up. We have a nice separation by using our sine wave, and we could adjust the contrast and the brightness. And if we need to, we could either add another filter to adjust the scale. We could also use a math node, or we can just adjust the actual fractal that we're using to adjust our ratio. But let's just go ahead and stick with this right now. I'm going to click OK, and then it's going to process in our terrain editor. We can see that show up. And now right now our scale is set to 1, so we're not previewing or seeing as much as we were seeing in the output observer. So I can change our scale to 0.5. And once that reprocesses, we can see basically what we were seeing before in our output observer. I also note that I have 256 by 256 pixels, so it does look very pixelated. I'm just going to keep it at that right now so that it processes a little bit faster, and it's not going to affect our render whatsoever. We'll click OK to add that to our scene. And in order to get this to really look correct in how we had it before, we can do one of two things. We can either just scale down our z-axis, or we can go in and actually edit our filter. So I can double click to open up our terrain editor. And for our filter that's located underneath our altitude production, we could either bring down that right side, which will lower our terrain. So I could go to edit filter, and we could just bring that down, click OK. And that's just going to smooth it out, make it a little bit lower. If we click OK and take a look at it in our scene, we notice it's much lower. So we can also do that, or like I've said, we can switch to our scale mode and just bring that down on the Z. Sometimes it's just better to edit the filter, but it really depends on what it is you're working on. If we move back to the move mode, also going to want to move this up above our ground plane so that we don't have that infinite ground cutting through anywhere. And let's just take a look at a render for this so that we can really see the details. And I'm just going to zoom in so we can see a large amount of our surface. Nice and close up so it fills the entire view. And I also want to make sure we're viewing as much of the actual function as possible in all of our different variations. So I'm just going to position our camera. And then we can take a look at the preview and see if that fits up correctly. And one thing I might want to do is adjust our lighting before we do anything else. So I'm going to go up to our atmosphere editor, and under Sun, I'm just going to reposition our position, the azimuth, in other words, the rotation around our object, and the pitch will adjust how high our sun is in the sky. But this looks like it should be good. I'm also going to go to our light tab and just move a little towards ambient, and that way we can see some of those shadowed areas and some of the definition a little bit better. And before we add a material to this, let's just take a look with our default surface, and that way we can see the actual definition that the terrain is creating rather than what's being created from a surface. So I'm going to go up to our render options, set this to final, render to screen, 800 by 600, click OK, and then we can just click on that render. If we take a look now at the finished render, we can see we have a lot of detail in our terrain. It looks really neat, even without a material on and just our default material. We can also see that we have a lot of definition in certain areas, even without there being a bump map, because of course the procedural terrains will allow us to just create an infinite amount of detail. Now in this case, what I might actually want to do, because if we take a look at some of these areas where we have these very high peaks, those might be a little bit too high. So one thing we can do is just scale it down in the Z, or we can adjust our filter. So I'm just going to close this out, and I'm going to change this to our scale mode and just bring down on our Z a little. And that way we don't have those extremely high areas, and it's something a little more even and a little bit easier for us to see, and definitely something that looks more like what we were working on originally that we saw in the output observer. And then we can just add a material to this that's fitting. And for the material version render, if you just take a look in the examples folder of the tutorial, you'll be able to see exactly what this terrain looks like at a higher resolution render, full quality, without worrying about the compression of the tutorial video. And then you'll be able to see that a little bit better and exactly what that terrain is going to look like when it has a proper material loaded. But let's go back into function editor. And we're just going to right mouse click, edit function. And let's make some more modifications to this terrain. And one thing I'm going to do is just disconnect our turbulence from our simple fractal that we had, where we were controlling the wavelength. So we can remove that now. And we'll just let that reload. And we can see how much of a dramatic change that really is by adjusting that wavelength. And I'm just going to delete our advanced turbulence altogether, and even delete our offset math node. Or what we could actually do is just alter that and change it to something else to create a different sort of effect. I'm also going to remove our filter with our sine wave, and I'm going to adjust what we're using for each of our different fractals. going to change the Voronoi to crystals, and then also our distribution from Voronoi to something a little less complex. We can use a value gradient. We can see that loading up. And we're going to select that offset filter or math node that we had. And I'm going to change that to rotation and twist. Click on edit and just adjust some of our rotations. And now this is just affecting our first input. Let me adjust that on Z. And then we can twist this. And our different values to give us a more interesting look. We'll just close that out. And now we can see we have a sort of a similar effect that we were getting from that advanced turbulence, but something that loads a lot quicker just by using our math node. And if we want, we can adjust our overall value with another filter. So we'll just select our link between our blender and our altitude, and I'm going to add a filter to that. And right now it's set to sine wave, and we can see that showing up. And that gives us a very neat looking terrain. So we're going to stick with that and just click OK. And take a look at this in our terrain editor. You can see that showing up. I'm going to click OK. And we'll just take a look at our preview render. You can see in this case we might even want to raise that z-axis, maybe back up a little bit. But let's just do a quick render of this, take a look at the detail. And then if you also look back in the examples folder, you'll be able to see another render of this with a material that's a little more high resolution. And like I said, so you don't have to worry about compression settings in the video destroying the quality. And now we could just see the default material on this terrain. And I just went ahead and raised up on the z-axis just a little and stretched that just a tiny amount. But we can tell that there's a lot of detail, and overall the material and terrain just looks really, really good. So I'm just going to close this out, and let's go back into our terrain editor. We're going to go back and take a look at our function. Go to Edit Function. And there's just one last thing I want to take a look at and show you. I'm going to change this to a filter. Our filter node that's just above our altitude, where we currently had a sine wave on. And I'm going to click on Edit Filter. And let's just go ahead and make a few edits to this. I'm going to turn on Smooth Curve mode, add a new key point, and just give us a little bit of a change. And just a tiny dip towards the top. And we can see that sort of going in some of our areas. And the first thing I want to take a look at is our upper clamping mode and our lower clamping mode. And if you remember before with some of our filters that have clamping, it has to do with how we have our cutoffs at specific areas of our terrain. Basically, the thing this is going to be affecting the most right now, at least with our upper clamping mode, is this top section and the upmost area. So we can see under upper clamping mode, we have a couple of different options. We have continue, which is the default, and usually something that works the best. But we can also set that to clamp. And what that's going to do is just smooth out that entire surface, and it won't end up going back down in. We also have a mirror mode, and we'll just let that refresh. And that ends up looking about the same as our previous mode. And it really depends on what it is that you're working on and what you're working with. A lot of these we won't really necessarily see some of the changes, but I'm going to change our upper clamping mode to repeat now, and now we can see that's just completely cut out, and we really don't have a blend. If we also take a look at the filter node preview, over here on the left, we can see this black section showing up with that repeat. If we change it to mirror, we really don't see any change. Continue looks about exactly the same, although it is a little bit darker. So actually what you will notice is that with our mirror mode on, it will not dip down as far, and it'll be just a little bit higher. And we can kind of see that. And then the clamp mode, if you take a look in the preview, you'll see that's completely white, which is why we're seeing that smoothed out. So I'm just going to set this back to continue. And if you take a look at the lower clamping mode, this is going to affect our lower parts of our object. So over here on the left, and anywhere where we're basically entirely black. So we can set that to clamp. And now with this, we're really not going to notice too much of a change. We can set that to continue, which is the default, mirror, and also repeat. Now in this case, like I said, we're really not going to see too much of an effect. We do notice that with repeat on, we have the areas that are entirely black are being protruded outward and raised up to basically the highest level. And that's because it's repeating our entire filter at that level. And what's going to happen is we're just going to end up with these raised areas. And on certain filters and certain terrains, you're going to get entirely different results. So let's change that back to continue. And what I want to take a look at now is our influence of environment, which is something I said I was going to come back to. So I want to make sure that we go over a lot of these settings. Now we can change this to make it dependent on altitude. And then we can change it from none to strong, which is a percentage value. Now currently it's set to 50%, so we can see the majority of our terrain has been cut out because of the amount of altitude that is being preserved. I can reduce this value, and we can take a look after it refreshes, and now we can see less of the lower values are being cut out. So the higher this value is, the more of the lower amounts are going to be cut out, and just the higher altitudes will be left over. So now we can just see those higher altitudes. Change that back down to around 50%. And we also have the ability to adjust our minimum and maximum altitude. Our maximum altitude right now is 10 meters. Well, I can increase that to 16 meters. And we really won't see too much of a change if I decrease our max altitude to 5 meters. And we take a look. It's basically about the same. Our minimum altitude, we can go ahead and raise that up just a few meters. And we don't really see an overall effect. But what we're basically setting is our 100% value, which is our max altitude, and our minimum, which is our 0%. So we have the ability to just change these altitudes. So if we want to have a specific value that we want to be our max altitude, we can easily change that. And also keep in mind, once again, just take a look in the filter node preview so we can see the grayscale image of exactly what's going to be left over. I'm going to turn off dependent of altitude right now, and we're going to move on to the next, which is our dependent of slope. And now what we're going to be adjusting is basically what's left over dependent on our actual slope. Now a lot of these are going to look very similar to the altitude. So let's just take a look and make this a little bit higher. And we can see that really does look about the same. And once we bring it up to a very high amount, we just have that upper part. And bring that down. And we're just adjusting which parts of the overall slope that we see. Lower values on the bottom and more steep values towards the upper part. We can use these both together. Change our minimum altitude down to 0 and our max up to about 10, where we were before. And we could decrease our altitude level. And we can see they work together very nicely. Of course, with too high of values, we're going to see a lot of cutouts. So it's one thing to keep in mind when we use these two together, but they will affect each other quite a bit. If I turn off our slope right now, we can just see the altitude. We turn that off, and now we can also have dependent on orientation. So we can adjust how strongly we are affecting our object based on the orientation and the angle in which we are adjusting this to. Now in this case, we're really not going to see a change, and if we take a look at our preview, we're not noticing any changes at all. And that's because of the type that we're working on and the terrain that we're working on. And in a lot of cases, when you're working on terrains, that's really not going to create too much of a change. But if you're working with materials, you will definitely see an overall change. We'll go ahead and just modify this filter just a little bit. We'll pull that out. Turn off our orientation and back on, and we still don't really see a change. So it's not dependent on our filter at all. And it's mainly something you're going to see, especially for materials. But here, even with this filter, we have a very interesting looking terrain. Click OK. We can see that showing up. And you can see how easily it is to modify even the exact same parameters, because we're basically working with the same thing we had before, but just by modifying that filter, we've created an entirely different look for our terrain. Just click OK, and we can view that in the terrain editor. Click OK again, and that will be added to our scene. And then we can just render that out and see what that's going to look like. And we can see this rendered out very nicely. And our filter has created some really neat looking effects, a lot of different variations, and some nice smoothing over the tops of some of these objects. And if you take a look in the examples folder, you'll be able to see a material render of this. And if you're looking to learn more, I've also included a couple of different terrains as scene files in the examples folder. So you can open those up and take a look at the functions that were used to create them. And you can just go ahead and pick those apart and figure out exactly how they were made, and you'll be able to learn a lot more about how different terrains are created. And I hope you've learned a lot from this tutorial, and that you understand a little bit more about the function editor and exactly how terrains are created within it.